trots up and down La Strada in pinstripe suits. The nonna who scrubbed her floors to perfection each morning. Rita, the eyes of the quarter, who gave me coffee and shared gossip. The mother who scorned her child in public under the watchful eyes of Jesus. And many, many others.
To recover from this pandemic requires people to have resilience. And if some groups in society are left vulnerable and exposed, then none of us are going to have resilience.
For most people, a house with central heating is more important than art, capitalized or not.
Throughout history, rulers have used and abused art for political and personal ends.
You will erect a monument because you are proud of that person or that event, because it reflects your identity, because you want to walk down your public space and say, look at that, that is our leader. We have to remember which side of the story is actually missing.
Nowhere in Europe is the weaponization of history more visible than in Hungary and Poland, where illiberal governments are on a crusade to remodel the education system.
Europe has to save the world of art to save itself. Only in free societies can art be truly free, and vice versa.
You don't have to clean hospitals or volunteer at the food bank to be worthy of your asylum in Britain. You don't have to climb balconies in Paris to rescue a dangling toddler to be granted your protection. By reaching a safe country, by starting over, you've already done more than enough.
So yes, there's an importance to understand how the space can bring us closer together.
Je ne prends pas le micro, hein, moi. Hein. Non. Beste vrienden, chers amis, dear friends. On behalf of my team at BOZAR Agora and of Paul Dujardin, CEO of BOZAR, I welcome you to the most prestigious venue of the Center for Fine Arts, La Salle Henri Leboeuf. I say it in French, but it sounds much better. We have chosen this location for two reasons. First of all, we wanted to make sure that this event could take place with respect for all necessary precautions. We never expected to have 2,000 people here. The COVID crisis is not over, on the contrary, so please respect the rules, wear a mask, and keep a safe distance. But the second reason to hold this event here is because the magazine and the podcasts that we are presenting today deserve only the best. But I also welcome all the people all over the world who are following this event through our live streaming. And that's an advantage of the COVID period, because otherwise, normally we don't do that. Normally our department organizes debates and workshops, conferences and events where we invite brilliant speakers from all over the world to discuss the problems of today. We had plans to invite 10, maybe 20 or 30 speakers for more than 6 debates in the framework of our May Days in the month of May, as you might have guessed. Traditionally, we organize these debates around the 9th of May, which is Europe Day, to discuss the past, the present, and the future of Europe. This year, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration, which is, in fact, the birth of the European Union, as you might say. But we also remember that 75 years ago, the World War II came to an end, and the Cold War started, but also transatlantic relations were tightened. But then came the COVID crisis. My colleague Pamela Peters and I were in shock by the idea that we had to cancel the Maydays, but we had no choice. We then came up with the idea of making a magazine, but since this is not the core business of a cultural institute, we hooked up with the team of Are We Europe, a magazine for European ideas produced by a wonderful group of journalists and media wizards. And we were blessed that we could work with strong partners that have helped us before, the Evans Foundation, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and the Open Society European Policy Institute. I thank them very much. The title Mayday is a wordplay, a pun. Mayday is the international distress signal, and it was first used in the maritime world in the British Channel between France and the UK. The word has French origins, m'aider, aidez-moi, help me. I think today we can hear the distress call in the British Channel, but it's a different one than it was when the distress call was invented. We call Mayday Magazine a distress call for the future, because we hope that future generations will look back on us feeling sorry for us. I hope that they will consider the 21st century as a temporary moment of insanity and despair in human history. I hope that they will live in better times and tell their children that the first 2 decades in the 21st century were a bad example of how human beings must treat each other and our planet. My name is Karel van den Broek. I will be your host for this afternoon, and it is with great pride that I present to you Mayday Magazine and the podcasts. When you entered the hall, you might have noticed that you could hear parts of the podcast and the magazine, and in between the conversations I will have this afternoon, you will hear other pieces of the magazine. The first people I want to ask to sit here with me are Frank Andrews and Anneleen Ophoff, and there is a reason why I asked them first, because they are part of that wonderful team of Are We Europe. I must say, we worked with them as we would work with a composer or a company of theater or a visual artist. We asked them to make a magazine for us, but it's their magazine. Frank is the editor-in-chief. Anneleen made the podcast, or was responsible for the podcast. We're just commissioning a magazine like we commission works of art. So it's not BOZAR and its partners who hired a copyright firm to write what's in our mind in better words. Anneleen, maybe I can start with you. Can you tell us something more about what you do and what you are? Are We Europe? What's Are We Europe?
Yeah, so Are We Europe is a network of over 500 storytellers all around Europe. And it started a little bit as an answer to this feeling that something was missing in the European public sphere and in journalism in general. And it started 5 years ago. Today we have these 500 plus storytellers, from videographers in Krakow to poets or photographers in Athens. And together we make a magazine that is published every 3 months. It's always about a subject that we try to put into a pan-European perspective. We also make multimedia stories, we make podcasts. And the one thing that binds us all is that we are always trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be European, and how can we tell stories that are often untold from voices that are unheard of and from places that are less traveled?
Mm-hmm. Frank, I'll turn to you. Can you tell the audience how we went about in making the Mayday magazine? Because normally I'm a journalist as well. Normally when you make a magazine, you have lots of beer, cigarettes and pizzas, and you start brainstorming. But we couldn't do that now. We were all at home behind our laptops.
Beer and cigarettes on our own at home. So after we began the collaboration with you, and we spoke to you about what you wanted, what BOZAR wanted, I should say. We sort of went through our normal process of making a magazine. We write a call for submissions and we post that in our networks. Sorry. We post our call for submissions in our networks of creators on social media. Obviously, nothing in person. And we were lucky enough to get 50 or so pitches back, pretty solid pitches. And then it's just a question of going through those and making that collage of pieces to make the magazine coherent and adhere to the idea that we set out at the beginning.
So in fact, it's the collaborators who not decide the final decision, but you're dependent on their input. It's not that you give out, I want a story about that, I want you to interview that guy. It's much more bottom-up than top-down, which is usually the case in journalism.
So we put the idea out and we give some potential stories. We get what we get back. And if we felt there were holes, so we felt we were missing a climate piece, we felt we were missing something about the transatlantic relationship, and then we might go, okay, we know this author, we know this journalist, we might commission something, but it is more bottom up than top down.
Yeah, we'll be seeing a lot of the magazine behind my back, and I can see it on the monitor before me. But can you give a few examples of what people after this event can read in the magazine?
Well, obviously the editor's note, which I wrote, is the best piece in there. So we have I think one of my favorite pieces was we have an interview with a man called Hassan Akkad, who's a Syrian refugee in England who's become a bit of a celebrity because he worked in a hospital during the COVID crisis. It's an interview with him talking quite frankly about his experience of being the good immigrant and what that's been like for him. We have an opinion piece about not the upsides of nationalism, but sort of the more positive elements of it and how it's conceived sort of in popular thought. All of the stories sort of speak to this idea that the trajectory that Europe's currently on is not necessarily looking that pretty. The idea of sort of where are we going, how have we got here, and which ideas from the future, which ways of thinking that we're not currently engaging in might change that trajectory for the better. So we also have a piece about climate technology and where that could go sort of more concretely in sort of solving future problems.
Anneleen, you were responsible for the podcast. There was a general idea behind it. And, can you tell us something? I remember that you surprised that we're going to ask people to make podcasts about outrageous things that in the past seemed, or today also seem ludicrous, but that maybe would be worth looking at.
Yeah, so first of all, we wanted that the podcast and the magazine really felt like they were existing in the same universe, so they were living together. So we took this idea of Mayday as a distress call, and very easily we fell into this discovery of all these new ideas that are coming up that we are all in favor of, or we're all experimenting with as possible new realities as like a post-pandemic society. Were actually not new ideas. Most of them had been around for ages, but they were ridiculed in the past, and at some point they were deemed too radical. So we really took that idea of ridicule, radical, and now reality, and spoke to experts on the issue, but also to voices on the ground. And we made sure that we had people from all over the world chipping in and giving their thoughts.
Can you give an example of one of these ludicrous ideas?
For example, the end of meat. Should we all become vegetarians? Is the meat industry, or stopping the meat industry, maybe the new climate action? We have UBI, or like basic income, that we are delving a little bit deeper into, with new examples as well on cash transfers as humanitarian aid. We have the very current issue of decolonization and removing statues. That is not a new idea either, but it did gain a lot of momentum today. It has been around for quite some time, so we're looking into that as well.
Frank, I'm also a journalist, and all over the world I see independent media popping up. It's very clear that on paper, also in podcasts, video, websites, there is a lot of new titles, new initiatives. And while everybody is thinking that media is in this deep crisis, this existential crisis, kind of perfect storm where newspapers are disappearing, the journalists are being laid off. How do you explain that richness and the speed with which that is going on and you're with Are We Europe are an example of that?
I don't think while the financial model seems to be in crisis, and journalism, like how journalism is viewed, seems to be in crisis and potentially at a breaking point. I think it's just because the diversity of ideas and the creativity and the thinking hasn't gone anywhere, and it's people trying to create new ways of getting ideas out there. I think the critical thing, though, for so many of these media organizations is being able to become sustainable and not just relying on philanthropy, which is what's happening at the moment. And that's one of the reasons why Are We Europe is, we're transitioning to a more membership-based model, which I think you see like a lot of these young media outlets doing as well. Mm-hmm. So I suppose that the innovation is, and the fact that media organizations are looking for perhaps more niches is so that they can find a target audience who are willing to pay for that and support them. But it's definitely tough out there. But Are We Europe luckily has found that nice niche, and it, despite what people were saying a couple of years ago, it's a lot of it's print and a lot of it is the feel of a magazine. Yeah. Which
it's the same with podcasts. I'm quite traditional in that way. I thought, okay, radio has existed forever. Now you're making podcasts. What's the difference between traditional radio making and podcasts?
Well, I would say that the biggest difference is making a podcast in a pandemic, because obviously you cannot go anywhere and record the voices and have like a nice little chat, which is a feeling that you want to get in a podcast. So it was sometimes a little bit hard to let go of that and see this as a new type of podcast. It is atypical, and it is calling people on the other side of the world and then asking them, okay, I will record this, but do you also have an iPhone or a different smartphone? Can you record this as well? And then we transfer it to me. It took a little bit of explaining sometimes because people were like, yeah, but you're calling me and you're the producer, so don't you have it all figured out?
No, go. Okay, I just want to add that we also included content that was produced by BOZAR itself. We had, during the summer, everything was closed, lockdown, and here on this stage we did interviews in the framework of a series that was called Repairing the Future, where the interviewer was on stage and the person interviewed was behind his laptop in New York. Or you can still see these interviews on our website, but one of them was with Edgar Morin, the French sociologist, who has a lifespan of almost 100 years now, and I can really recommend the interview that was conducted by Béatrice Delvaux of Le Soir, which is also included in the magazine. So that's the only contribution BOZAR had content-wise in the, although I wrote an article with my colleague Pamela as well, but that's up to you to read it. Okay, Frank, Anneleen, I would like to thank you for everything you did for us. It was great. I was hoping we could have a big party afterwards, but that we'll do that after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Literature is a wonderful way to show that there is more than one right path, one culture. The novel is our last democratic space.
The next guest I would like to call is very dear to me because I've known her for a long time. I asked her immediately if she wanted to collaborate on the Mayday magazine, and she said yes, to which I was certain she would. Judith Van Istendael. She's gone. Judith? Okay. Don't keep us waiting. Judith Van Istendael lives in Brussels, in Molenbeek, because Brussels is 19 communes, as you know. She's one of our best graphic novelists, but her work has always had this journalistic angle. I could say that because she's the daughter of a journalist, but I think there were more reasons for that. Judith is always looking with a keen eye to what's going on in the world and also very close to her. When Brussels, with the rest of the world, went into lockdown, I asked her if she would tell the story of Corona in Brussels. And she took to the streets of Molenbeek and her neighborhood to investigate the impact of the lockdown on her environment, on her neighbors. And the result is a stunning example of quality reporting in image and in words. So Judith, first of all, when I asked you to do this, what was the plan? How did you set about? What was your...
My first idea was to say no.
But that you always say no first.
He knows me. My first idea was really to say no because I thought everybody's talking about Corona and it's so tiring. It's a boring subject. But then, as usual, I thought a little bit and I said yes. And I always, when I have to make graphic journalism, I always am a little bit in despair because at the beginning I always think, what would I be telling that anyone would be reading that would add something to what we already know? And so I was talking a lot with my husband about this because it was really I didn't see what I could add to this story of Corona, but then I thought, okay, the thing that I'm really interested in, as I was reading the newspapers, that was a lot of specialists were telling there was a lot of suffering behind the walls of the houses that we don't know, but those people who suffer from Corona because they live in tiny places, because there is domestic violence, because their situation is very hard, they never come in the newspaper. It's always
very middle class.
Very, very, very middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And all the measures that were taken in Belgium for Corona and COVID were focused on middle class living and possibilities. Mm-hmm. And so I tried to get behind the walls in my neighborhood, which is a very, very poor neighborhood with a lot of intense social, economical problems. And only this was already very difficult to find people who were ready to talk about it.
And was it the first time that you met your neighbors?
No, of course not. It's not the first time. I lived there since my daughter is 18.
But that you were in their houses?
No, it's not the first time. My children went to a neighborhood school, so we know families that live very difficult lives. The best friend of my son, he is a boy who lives in a social building with 5 people in 40 square meters or something. It's hard. It's just unimaginably small, and they have no money. It's a very, very intense situation where the mother is very unstable. There is a daughter with very big mental health problems. So it's an incredibly difficult situation. So I knew the people. It's not the only family I know, but it's a different. I couldn't go to this family and just ask them, can I interview you and can I draw you and then you'll be in the newspaper or in the magazine? What do you think about it? Nice, no? You cannot do this because it's too close to. I know them too well, and it would be. I think I would make them feel naked. So I try to find people I don't know and that can talk to me because I'm a bit further from them, and so that's what I tried to do. That's what I did, and I tried to talk to people working also.
And what's the most memorable encounter you had during your research?
This one, the one you see there. Because this was an encounter with a woman. It was organized by a Moroccan woman she's Belgian, but and I went to their place and I didn't realize that they didn't have papers. So the first thing, and I entered a very beautiful house. It was not very big, but it was extremely beautiful. It was such a nice place, living room, and they looked middle class people, and then she said, "Do you know we don't have papers?" And then they started telling the stories about how it was difficult to get out of the house because they were always scared, and how Corona took all their jobs from them because, of course, they work in illegal situations, so they don't have any insurance, any security of keeping their job. So they were cut of their income from one day to the other. They were living from donations. It was a terrible
How are they
story.
informed of the measures that are taken by the government? Are they informed, or
Of course, they have a news. They watch the news. They watch the internet. They have a phone. They have one phone for the whole family. They have no computer, but they have a big television, so they are informed by all possible means.
Yeah. You said I went there, and I normally when I'm a journalist, I have my tape recorder or I have my notebook.
I couldn't.
But you have to draw these people. So do you ask them before, can I make a drawing and interview afterwards, or is it during the interview that you make sketches?
So it's a very much prepared thing because it's people, they don't want to be on the photo. Of course, they don't want to see, they are scared of the camera. I mean, they're illegal here, or they have huge poverty problems, and it's not a thing you're proud of, so it's very difficult to take their pictures. So I think so it was very, very prepared with intermediate persons that they trusted. It was all about creating trust. So it was a very slow process, and they were informed from the beginning. I asked them, am I allowed to take a picture with my phone to draw you, not to put the picture? And this is all about trust, because they have to trust you that you will not use this picture, that you will make a drawing, that you will draw them in an unrecognizable way, that you will respect their wishes. And so it was incredibly, the preparation took much longer than the actual interview.
Yeah. Do you feel that...
And I wrote by hand, yeah.
That graphic journalism adds a dimension to journalism, or it's, well, I'm always, I know it's a genre that in Belgium, or especially in the Flemish-speaking or the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, is still very small.
It's very small.
Yeah, in France, it's big. You cannot open a magazine or you can find a graphic journalism piece. But what's the difference between me doing this story with words and a photographer, and you drawing and writing it?
Well, I think you can see the difference here. You see me entering my door. I think by drawing, of course, it's a lie that photography isn't subjective, but it seems objective. I mean, it has this aura of objectivity. When you draw, of course, the subjectiveness of the journalist is extremely present. It's unavoidable that you see it. So I think there is a point of view that is immediately clear. And I think it's more clear about the subjectivity of the way you look at things. This is one thing. The other aspect, of course, is as I don't have to rely on photography to show things, I have a much more fluent way to gain the trust of people. People trust you much more when you're not there with the camera, when they know for sure that they will not be in a picture, you will only draw them. It's when you draw a portrait of somebody, there is a kind of respect also as a drawer, as an artist, and you create a bond because it's a slow thing. It's not something you do very fast. So when you draw their living room, it's a slow process. You have to be there for a while. So, and while you're drawing, people are talking. But of course you cannot write while you're drawing. It's very difficult. So, but you get so much information because they open up while you draw. So I think, yes, graphic journalism can tell different kinds of stories, but they are slower, much slower. They are more about personal contact, so you get different kinds of information. And
Do you have future plans in this? I know you always stay close to reality when you
Yeah.
work.
For me, I only made 2
Mhm.
reportage. I don't know how you say
Yeah.
this in English.
Reporting. Yeah.
Documents in graphic journalism, and twice it was extremely intense for me. It's because I'm always extremely stressed about respecting what the interviewed people say, what their truth is, the correct numbers. I'm extremely stressed when I make it, because when I make fiction, I'm very free. I can just invent my numbers and I can do whatever I want to. Here, I cannot. So, will I do it more? I guess so, because
if
you
I ask
ask
you.
me, if you ask me, yes, and if I think, oh yes, this is interesting, yes, but spontaneously, it's not something I start just like, let's do this. It's a very intense process.
Okay, great. Judith, we could continue all evening, but there are a lot of people that will follow behind you. So I would like to thank you and
Thank you.
congratulations with your result of your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In the Mayday magazine, we devote more than one article
In
to...
her first year
Sorry.
as a...
Okay, my fault.
We require a very realistic, strong understanding.
In her first year as a history teacher at Fairfield High School in Bristol, a city in southwest England, Kate Smee taught the mandated curriculum on the Magna Carta, Tudor monarchs, and Elizabethan intrigues. This year, she will be adding another module for her Year 7 class, a history of Somalia.
In the Mayday magazine, we devote more than one article to the issue of decolonization. There is an article about decolonizing development, which is an eye-opener. There's also a column, which is more light, on racism and feelings of inferiority in the dating world. And there is one about history teachers and how they help us to understand Europe's past, which is, of course, crucial for the future. To talk a bit more about decolonization and Black Lives Matter and racism, we invited 2 staff members of ENAR, the European Network Against Racism, which is a pan-European network. The organization was set up in 1998 by grassroots activists on a mission to achieve legal changes at the European level and make decisive progress towards racial equality in all member states. Sanka Abayawardena couldn't be here, but he recorded a video. So maybe we can look at that first.
We require a very realistic, strong understanding on what is colonialism. Is it really something of an old chapter in our common history? Or is it a continuous process of domination and enslavement that has taken on new forms and new shapes? In my view, colonialism is a process driven by a supremacist worldview. And this worldview at a philosophical level help European nations to see themselves as superior human beings and the rest of the world as created to serve them. The worldview also helped them, these nations, to justify their crimes at the cost of hundreds of millions of lives and destroy some of the world's oldest and most advanced human civilizations in the name of modernism. In other words, the colonial enterprise forced the rest of the world into destitution at gunpoint. The poverty and the social and political hell the world was pushed into facilitated a range of stereotypes driven by racist views of the other, how we, or how Europe, see the other. These racial stereotypes are fundamental to the racist discrimination of ethnic and religious minorities living in Europe even today. But this is not all. Not only Europe end up creating the so-called third world by centuries of exploitation They set up a world order to keep exploiting it. They did so by managing to build these extremely complex structures of economic, social, and political domination throughout the world, replacing systems, structures, and institutions developed by native civilizations over thousands of years. This international order was set up and maintained by force, especially at times a forced monopoly of knowledge enforced by a collaborationist class in these countries. These colonial structures develop rather into a complex international order. Officially, European governments ended their colonial rule in Africa and Asia and most of South America in the 1960s. But the European continent, the nation states, and the political union also continue to draw resources from these regions. The global hierarchy cemented through colonial rule since 16th century live on to this day in the global institutional framework and the rules-based international order that continue to drive the flow of global wealth into global north. How exactly is that this brutal system has evolved into the current world order? We have to understand that maintaining the colonial world rule is done today by institutionalizing it. Europe have redefined how we call this global political and economic structures while keeping the primary colonial purpose intact. Take most of the international development aid in nowadays. Western world is the savior, need to help countries to manage their own, rebuild their nationhoods, have to teach them how to not to kill each other, how to teach them how to better manage their natural resources. In other words, Europe still exports the idea that they are civilized while the rest of the world needs to be civilized. In other words, in order to be civilized, people need to look like Europe, think like Europe, act like Europe. Think of the migration crisis. Europe bears a major responsibility for the economic and political destabilization of Africa and Asia. Aren't Europe one of the major beneficiaries of the wealth continue to be taken from this region and also from South America? Are global north not waging proxy wars throughout the world to maintain these flows of wealth? This is why we need to understand how colonialism have evolved to be the bedrock of our current structures, institutional, political. How we see ourselves, how Europe see itself, and the world is the basis of how we build our social, political, and economic structures, and the institutions that operationalize them. Most importantly, we need to understand how racist worldviews are driving our own European structures, just like they drive colonial structures worldwide and result in the structural racism that we experience today. We must be able to understand how colonial worldview is based on this false sense of racial superiority and its effects on rest of the world as well as the minorities living in Europe. How come the European public political narrative is always negative when it comes to countries that does not fit into their worldview? How come the European foreign policy actually see any alternative to the current world order as a threat? How come these perceptions drive our view on minorities living in Europe? These are important questions that we need to ask. And the answers are obvious. The answers are in the question itself. I think it is time for us to clearly see that the colonial rule that Europe have created over centuries as the bedrock of our institutional framework. And this needs to change. Foreign policy of European nations and their approach to international development, and also their social policy, both internally and externally. Their education policy, their health policy, how they see their general governance within Europe, have a colonial root. Why is there a fair discussion on reparations and fixing such an oppressive system is so hard in Europe today? Today, both in these regions, civil society space is diminishing. Threat to human rights defenders by far-right and neo-Nazi groups are growing. Minorities and social justice activists are facing ever increasing challenges with no real perspective of seeing a change. They are continuing to be seen as outsiders in what, in far-right terms, a white continent, despite the modern European civilization being built on their shoulders. Europe continued to deny reparations and returning of the colonial loot. In Britain, no one even dare talk about colonial basis of their nation state. So the question is, what should we do? The simple answer is, we should decolonize now. Decolonize our institutions, decolonize our structures that these institutions drive, and decolonize our minds. Not tomorrow, now, right now. But how do we decolonize? Decolonization demands a worldwide effort that is based on restorative justice. This is very important to remember. No one is asking for eye to eye in today's world. Yes, colonial artifacts must go back to their places of origin. And not only that, the institutions from global north must stop and actively work to stop and prevent ongoing looting to acquire new assets. Yes, Europe must pay reparations, must dismantle the colonial structures that they have enforced over Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This also means Europe has to educate its population on colonialism and to educate people how Europe acquired its economic wealth. Where does it come from? And who had to pay for it? Most importantly, Europe has to start telling the truth. Global North is not the center of the universe. Global North, especially the European nations, has a responsibility to reform the international institutional order wherever they can and reconstitute it entirely from scratch when they have to reflect the diversity of the world. Not to reflect their own worldview, but to represent the world as a whole. Instead of creating regional armies, Europe needs to set a precedent based on mutual respect and equality to create a new representative and democratic international order. This is the real rules-based international order that the entire world wants to see. This is nothing new to Europe. This was done before, quite successfully. Remember Germany's massively successful denazification program? What we need is an effective decolonization process. The world is moving forward. The real question is, if Europe and the rest of global north want to keep up and be a part of an ever-changing world, or be an outcast.
I would like to ask Julia Santos Walgren of A&R to join me, and I will ask her a few questions. Juliana, welcome. Glad you could be here. We looked at Sanka at the video. I have two questions for you, just to put this into a framework. Do you feel that the Black Lives Matter movement that started in the United States, and which is much older than last year, some people tend to forget that, is forcing also European countries to reckon with their colonial past? Or do you see that this is a ripple effect that's going to slow down?
I think Black Lives Matter definitely brought a change, specifically because it's talking about the structural barriers and the reality that people of color and people face every day. So Black Lives Matter is about police brutality, police violence, and that is linked to institutional and structural racism. But it's also about how we create forces to address the inequalities in the society. So I think what Black Lives Matter brought to Europe was this feeling of unity, that we cannot tackle structural inequalities alone, and not with one community standing alone either. We need to find allies to also join these forces. And I think what is interesting in Europe, it was to see that usually we take a look outside Europe to criticize, but it was a moment of self-reflection. We had also our George Floyds. The Black community is over-policed and underprotected in Europe as well. So I think what Black Lives Matter brought is more visibility to the theme in Europe. And I think as well what is important to talk about is also the role of the media. Because like George Floyd in the US, overly reported because the media covers it every day. And it's not the case in Europe. When it's covered in European press, is rather in a portrait of criminalization of people of color or dehumanization. So Black Lives Matter brought this also how media can portray victims of racism, and understanding that when we are talking about racism, it's not about how one individual discriminates the other, but also how the structure perpetuated reinforces inequalities and violence.
And do you think it's possible to raise an awareness that this structural racism has its roots in colonialism in the past? And not that colonialism is already over; it still exists. But here in Belgium, of course, we're in a very particular place. The statue of Leopold II is just 500 meters from here. But do you think that the link between the police violence and the racism that people of color witness every day or are victims of every day can be used to raise this awareness of a more historical and more structural problem, or is it just raising, say, outrage and also violent reactions against, which can be for partly understandable as well? But I always wonder, is this going to really put the discussion of decolonization in a broader perspective on the agenda?
I hope so, but decolonization begins with acknowledgement. And I think it is specifically in the context of Belgium, I don't know if Belgium is ready yet to acknowledge its colonial past. And it's not only the past, we are talking about the abuses as well. So it's really interesting to see how far we can mobilize around Black Lives Matter. It's interesting to see how media is pitching that. It's interesting to see how we can mobilize hundreds, thousands of people in the street. But I'm sure that in December, we're still going to see Zwarte Piet in the supermarkets and at schools. So decolonization is also about talking about how Zwarte Piet affects children. And since their early age, so racism begins at 4, 3, 60 years old. So I think it requires an honest conversation about cultural stigmas, but also symbolism for the Belgian culture. So I hope we can have an honest debate where we can really dig into these historical portraits of Black people in Belgium, and also understand how daily racism affects people beyond only police brutality.
Just talk about your organization, European Network Against Racism. I'm quoting from your website. You want to remove structural barriers affecting racialized minorities. That sounds good, but what's your arsenal of weapons to convince European Parliament member states to really implement or really to make a policy that removes these structural barriers? Can it be removed by law or by government?
Our work is very challenging because we have to face reality, but we have to keep hope. So what we do is really to try to bring more visibility to the issue. I don't know if you know, but we have no data based on race and ethnicity in Europe. We cannot disaggregate data. So when you're invisible, you don't exist. So our main focus is really to focus on research and bringing more evidence to the table to work on advocacy, but also to ensure that we can still bring to the European agenda or to the national agenda things that are relevant to the people who are affected by racism and not by people who think they know what racism is about. So structural barriers also mean that we have to empower people on the ground. We have to bring more diversity, but diversity doesn't mean tokenism. We don't want just to be a code on the system or a number. We want to see really full representation and recognition of our voices, our demands on the table. So to remove a structural barrier, it's a daily effort. We hope that 2020
Okay, Juliana, I think there is a problem with your mic, but we can close here. I thank you very much for your words. Thank you, and see you.
The pandemic has highlighted inequalities in our society and pushed millions more into financial precarity, ripe for the nationalist populist picking.
Heather Grabbe is director of the Open Society European Policy Institute, which is the EU policy arm of the Open Society Foundations. And it works to ensure that open society values are at the heart of European policies and actions, both inside and outside its borders. OSEPI was one of the partners of the Mayday Magazine, and I'm very, very glad that I can invite Heather Grabbe on the stage. Heather. Blow in your mic, so I'm sure it works.
Yes, I think it does.
Okay, because the last one didn't. Heather, we were talking in the beginning of the event with the guys from Are We Europe about the podcasts, about the ridiculed and radical and reality ideas once seemed ridiculous and are now slowly gaining a place in our society. Do you see some of these formerly considered ridiculous ideas finally emerging in the mainstream of the European Union?
What's incredible about the past few years is how seemingly marginal ideas that were ridiculed, that were seen as impossible, like a minimum basic income, for example, or the idea that the economy should work for people rather than simply making profits for corporates. These are now becoming so mainstream that they appear in the dialogue, for example, of the Commission President, von der Leyen. Her speech just a few weeks ago in the European Parliament, her State of the Union address, she talked about things like we need to have a human economy. She talked about planetary fragility, and she emphasized how much we need to look at how to protect people from capitalism. She didn't quite use those words, but these are ideas that are not so familiar from a centre-right politician. And the European Union, which has been an economic project for many decades, and which focuses around a single market, to start bringing in all of these social dimensions related to how to push forward a major system change to a sustainable economy into planetary terms, and also one where the digital revolution doesn't leave people behind. Another thing she talked about. That's really quite amazing.
Isn't it quite cynical that we need a pandemic to realize that that the system has to change?
I'm not sure about that, because the pandemic has pointed up, it's really highlighted some of the things that have to change, particularly the social safety net, the need to help people through really difficult times, and also how fragile our systems are. You know, the just-in-time delivery systems for food, for example, suddenly became a huge issue when lots of workers couldn't do their jobs. So it pointed up some of the fragility and the need to build resilience in societies and in systems. But the longer-term trends of, I think of climate and digital are the ones that really driving the radical thinking.
Where do you think the European project is going next? It was born out of the Second World War and the urgent need to reconciliation and to safeguard the peace. But we're living in a time where the younger generations, and I'm 53, I never witnessed the war, the Cold War, of course, but not the bombs falling on European cities. How do you think that this, well, the raison d'être of the European Union can still be passed on to next generations if this memory of war is luckily, in Europe then, because the rest of the world has known war, and Europe has known war as well. But it's not the same sensitivity. And does that mean that the European project itself has to be redefined also?
I think it does, yes, because for millennials and later generations, even the Cold War isn't really relevant. And definitely the idea of armed conflict on the continent of Europe, which of course we did experience with the Balkans less than 3 decades ago, but it fades in collective memory quite quickly. But I think that the European Union needs to keep adapting with each generation because the collective action that it allows countries to have, where they don't just go it alone and have a national response to a crisis or a national attempt to avert climate change, is clearly not going to work. There are far too many really difficult problems out there which no one country can solve on its own. So you need collective action with a community of law, with functioning institutions, and the EU can provide those. But it's very important the EU doesn't get too tied up with its own myths. These myths that, well, we've been here for all these decades, therefore we'll continue forever, we've always been relevant, so we will always be relevant. No, you have to keep becoming relevant and to take on new things. And to be fair, I think that the EU institutions have taken on things like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement has led to an anti-racism action plan just in the last week, which is a remarkable thing, how quickly they adapted. But they also need to adapt fast to the expectations of society, especially this protective function that people want. They want to see that they're protected and that there isn't that interdependence and globalization and having a global economy, which the EU has always been keen on, are not actually threatening their livelihoods and ultimately their lives.
I was wondering if the COVID pandemic now, what it has done to a theme that's also preoccupying you, I know, is populism. It was growing all over Europe, and not only in Europe, but also in the United States and in Brazil and in the Philippines. You see these remarkable politicians standing up and saying words that we never held possible, that they would be part of the political sphere or the society. But do you think that populists have lost support and that it will be something that will last and that people will, I don't know why I'm saying this, but are coming to their senses?
Well, populism is always there in any democratic system. It's the dark side of democracy, and it's an opportunistic way of doing politics. Essentially, it's not an ideology. It's a way of doing politics which seeks to criticize the institutions and be anti-establishment and offer seemingly simple solutions to very complex problems. So when you've got a really huge and urgent and immediate crisis, populists don't do very well because people want a very clear authority. They don't want a joker in power on the whole. They want somebody who's going to seize the reins and deliver services, deliver healthcare, deliver social security, make sure that food still arrives in the shops, and so on. So incumbent governments, and particularly the kind of more sober kinds of governments, have done well. Think about Angela Merkel. Her explanation of the science of how the virus spreads on German television went viral all over the world because it was a political leader who made sense on the virus. So she, and also Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, for example, have done well because they brought a very calm, very authoritative but very calm approach to the crisis, whereas the more the kind of the strongman reality TV show theatrical politics of Donald Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Duterte in the Philippines have not done so well.
Do you think it will have a definitive effect on the outcome of the American elections, which are coming up very soon, and nobody wants to make any predictions because last time everybody said Hillary Clinton was going to win, and now even the pollsters are. But do you think it has an effect on the political climate in the United States as well, or is that something very, very specific, the American political climate?
No, I think it has had an impact. I'm not living in the US, but I observe how Donald Trump's flip-flopping and U-turn about the virus. No, it's not important. Oh, it's just a cold. And then taking it really seriously. And of course, now he's actually caught it. This does do him harm. But there's a lot of other things going on as well. His tax returns, the suppression of the vote in lots of parts of the US. This is important. But I think the key thing about the elections over the next few years is that politicians will do well if they've got a convincing narrative about how to recover from this crisis. That's very hard for any of them to do while there's still no vaccine. But it's also hard to do when actually COVID's the first of many crises. Climate change and lots of biodiversity is going to bring a lot more crises. If we can't cope with this one, think about how it'll be in future. So I'm looking for the political leader who could make resilience a reality.
Mm-hmm. And to make, well, the climate, in the COVID crisis, we depend on science because politicians are not going to make the vaccine. But in the climate discussion, science is not always center stage in the discussion. It's more economic arguments, or maybe also a lot of politicians are complete in denial about climate change. Could that change as well? Could science have a more prominent place in politics and in this decision making than what in the period we're coming out of?
Intentionally marginalized by industrial and political interests who want to keep things as they are. And scientists have been saying for 3 decades now that the planet is warming and that this is a serious problem. But now people are starting to feel it on their skin. Even here in Belgium, we've had the hottest year on record. That's the case in most parts of the world and also in the Arctic. We're actually feeling extreme weather conditions which affect crops, which affect how the whole economy functions. And as those real effects of climate change and also very bad things that we're quite close to happening, like the loss of bees and other pollinators with the collapse of insect stocks. As these things happen, suddenly people will be very interested in the science. The problem is, by then, we'll be beyond the tipping points. Already, the UN scientists advising the UN are saying we've only got 9 years to take really concerted action simply to limit climate warming to 1.5 degrees, which is already a huge change. So I think the danger is that human beings will pay attention to science, but by then it will be too late.
And the clock is ticking. What I think, and maybe I could ask you, if the politicians and the people who are in charge now screw up this time, then we will have to deal with more than just populism, I think.
Absolutely, and civic unrest. We come back to this whole question of war, not tanks, but civic unrest, and what one author has called the armed lifeboat becomes a real possibility. That those who, sauf qui peut, those who have resources seek to grab them and protect them and set up boundaries around them. And so instead of solidarity and sharing and finding collective solutions, which is what we really need, people start withdrawing to what they have and pulling up the drawbridge. This is a huge danger, and that's where representative democracy needs to find new ways of talking to people about how to find collective action.
We just need 3 meals, not eating 3 meals to have a revolution. Yes. Okay. Heather, thank you very much. It's very glad that you were here today in these difficult circumstances, and thank you very much for the support that you gave the magazine, and I hope, as I'm keep on repeating, we will have this party to celebrate it when the thing is over. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I was expecting sound, but I will continue. Under the current conditions, Irene Braam of the Bertelsmann Foundation, one of the other fine partners of this magazine, couldn't be here. But she sent us a wonderful video that focuses on the subject that has been preoccupying her and the foundation for a long time, and that's the relations between Europe and the United States. We talked about it with Heather. Bertelsmann Foundation not long ago asked the people of Are We Europe, the same guys that made the magazine, to make this video, and it explains the challenges of today. The American elections are coming up very soon, so this video could not have come at a better time.
Before the United States declared its independence, French fur traders set up remote outposts in Minnesota, and the Spanish sailed through the Florida Keys. Revolutionary France a fellow republic, was an early ally that would later gift the Statue of Liberty to the new US. By the 19th century, European leaders were reluctantly recognizing the United States as a growing political force. More conservative powers viewed the Republican ideals of the American experiment as chaotic, destabilizing, and dangerous. Ideas that needed to be kept away from Europe's empires and kingdoms. European states still wanted access to the burgeoning US market, and the Atlantic was soon crisscrossed with steamships and trade deals, promising friendship, commerce, and navigation. Ocean liners enabled mass immigration from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe, and as ships crossed the ocean, so too did ideas. Debates over isolationism and internationalism waxed and waned. 2 world wars scrambled what had been the prevailing global order. These conflicts left a powerful vacuum, and Europe and the US stepped in to fill it. During and after the Second World War, European refugees fled to places like California, where they established media empires and created films of enduring fame like Casablanca. While Europeans in exile helped build Hollywood, American jazz and blues artists flooded nightclubs in Paris, planting the seeds for Europeans' infatuation with American music. These musicians, many of whom were African American, experienced freedoms they hadn't had in the US. Their return home from Europe helped bolster early efforts that grew into the US civil rights movement. In the wake of World War II, the US provided a massive economic stimulus package to 18 war-torn European countries, nearly $130 billion in today's terms. This helped participating economies outperform pre-war levels and is generally regarded as pivotal in currying American favor in Western Europe against Soviet influence in the East. Americans and Europeans also established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO symbolized Western security and solidarity throughout the Cold War, ultimately contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the flower power decade of the 1960s, anti-war movements spread through both sides of the Atlantic. The Beatles, the Doors, and the Rolling Stones took over record players from Athens to Atlanta. In 1968, Czechoslovakians donning American blue jeans took to the streets to demand liberal reforms, while Americans protested the Vietnam War. In Poland, cowboys in Western films rallied the resistance. Hey Jude played on the radio, while activists in Nordic nations laid the foundations of the contemporary environmental movement. Later, bootlegged Hollywood VHS tapes played behind the Iron Curtain in countries like Romania, convincing viewers that another world did exist. The fall of the Berlin Wall would symbolize the collapse of the Soviet Union, and, with it, the growing sphere of American influence and the opportunity for a more unified Europe. With the fall of the wall came a renewed sense of urgency to fortify the transatlantic relationship. President Reagan's conviction politics had rattled transatlantic relations, and France's refusal to support the American invasion of Iraq was met with an effort to rename French fries in the US. The Obama administration was caught spying on German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and in 2016, isolationist Donald Trump was elected president.
Thank you very much.
In Europe and the US today, crumbling towns abound, increasingly abandoned in favor of shiny metropolises like Barcelona or San Francisco. Militant conservatism and a desire to go backward in time are rising. Some oppose big government, while others think the government isn't doing enough. When the US president vows to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris, it can feel like the world's two best friends are drifting apart. But if the history books tell us anything, these debates about the transatlantic relationship are nothing new. Rural farmers in Lithuania and Kansas share a similar set of concerns: increasing urbanization, the effects of climate change on agriculture, and a quickly digitizing world that is overtaking traditional lifestyles. Other problems like rising housing costs, data privacy, and automation worry younger generations on both sides of the Atlantic. Our collective history underlies and in many ways has produced this set of similar problems. For centuries, it is the citizens on both sides of the Atlantic who have constructed and maintained the heart of the transatlantic relationship. Despite what seem like widening fissures between two great allies, Our shared past reminds us that we are living through history and that the future will always be better when we take it on together.
Our next guest is Philippe. Is Philippe Van Parijs. I couldn't. I will make the joke. He came by bicycle because he lives in Brussels, but his name is Van Parijs. I think that's funny. Philippe Van Parijs is a political philosopher and economist. Teaches at universities all over the world, I must say, in Leuven, in Louvain, in Oxford, in Florence, but he's one of the most important thinkers of our time, and we're so glad that we have him here, so close here in Brussels. Professor, I asked you to read the magazine. Maybe I could start with that. Did you like it at all? There were some things that you thought inspiring, or?
Yes, I like the diversity of it. I was immensely struck by the interview with Edgar Morin, 99 years old and still so lucid. I felt suddenly like a gamin in comparison. And but also, I mean, for example, I think the article on climate change and what to do about it was, I think, very pedagogically written for people who follow it, but not that closely. And it contained, even though we had heard a lot about it, information that was new for me.
Yeah. You have been working a lot about Europe and European unity, and I was reading an article of you, a recent article, where you talk about this concept of a people's Europe. Now, it seems evident that a structure, a state, or an international organization representing these states should represent the people. Why are you so stressing that? I presume that you think that Europe is not a people's Europe at this moment.
Yeah, well, that article was in fact the lecture I delivered at the State of the Union event in Florence in the Palazzo Vecchio 3 years ago. And the title of the whole event was Towards a People's Europe. And the way I interpreted it was in two ways, very different. I meant it must be a Europe with a people in the sense of the demos of democracy. And it must be a Europe for the people of populism. And so what I mean by that very briefly is with the people, it means with the demos at the European level. It's not enough to have a variety of demoi, the democracies of each of our member states, 27 member states now. We need really a stronger demos at the European level. That means not only a European Parliament, but a civil society that is transnational. But at the same time, it must be a Europe for the people, and the people of populism. That means in opposition to the elites. And I think we are sometimes too tough on populism. In fact, the threat of populism is really a crucial virtue of any democracy. Because if you don't have constantly the threat of populism, the risk that some demagogic leaders will use the popular the resentment, well, then the ruling elites will only think of themselves and people like them in terms of their interests and in terms of their values. At the European level, they'll think of people like you in the room, like us here, people who move about, who are pleased that all the windows are being opened throughout Europe, the doors are being opened, it's an exhilarating freedom. But for many people, this is experienced as a threat to their security. And it's not only the windows that are being opened, the doors are being opened. There are all these people coming from all over the place and invading their familiar territories. The walls are being pulled down, and you have competition all over the place. And so this needs to be taken into account, and was not enough, is still not enough taken into account at the European level or at any level.
There's a general feeling that Europe has worked for the economy, has worked for corporate interests, and you, in another recent publication, you go to the past, to Margaret Thatcher, who, in effect, and I wasn't aware of that, in the beginning of her career, promoted United Europe, but she, of course, wanted a common market, because a common market would limit the powers of the member states to control the market. And now Great Britain is going away. We have the Brexit, which will happen. But you consider that to be a very big danger as well. So without the British, you will have this deregulatory force next to the European Union, which will have maybe less taxes and less regulations, so then have a false competition on the market.
Yeah, well, to understand both the internal threat within the European Union and the threat from post-Brexit the UK, it's useful not only to return to Thatcher, but also to go back a bit further to Friedrich Hayek, one of the great masterminds of so-called neoliberalism. He published an article in 1939 advocating something that looks very much like the description by its critics of the European Union today. And he thought it was fantastic. Why? For two reasons. One, he said, there will be this single market, even possibly a single currency, that will prevent each of the national states from interfering in the economy because of tax competition, because of regulatory competition, because of social competition between them. So you open the borders to competition, and that will reduce the capacity of each state to do what it used to do in the past, including in terms of redistribution. And then you might say, yes, but this will be done at the level of the Union. Not at all, he says, because it will be heterogeneous. There will be many different states with different interests and also lacking a common national identity.
There will be no demos.
Not only a demos, but also a strong common identity that will lead people to sacrifice their own interest to the others. He said, can you imagine that the clerk in the city of London would be willing to pay more for his bicycle for the benefit of the Belgian worker? He says, Hayek in 1939. The best pupil of Hayek was Margaret Thatcher. And what did she do? She said, yeah, let's go for the Single European Act that strengthened the grip of the single market, one. And two, let's also go for enlargement as much as possible. And so when she was prime minister, she advocated immediately, she was one of the most enthusiastic for the opening to the Eastern countries, thereby increasing the heterogeneity of the European Union. Fantastic. This is exactly the Hayekian neoliberal project. But then, after she left her job as prime minister, she started being scared because there were these guys like Joschka Fischer, when he was foreign minister in Germany, who thought, well, we are going to do what Hayek said is impossible when you have such a mixed, a diverse set of countries. And we are going to try to have, if not a European welfare state, have more solidarity at European level. Then she got scared. She said, this is a typical intellectual utopia whose only result will be disaster. Only the size of this disaster is unknown. And then, contrary to what she did in 1975, when she supported the yes in the referendum, the first referendum on the European Community at the time, then she became an advocate of the Brexit. And of course, the Brexit could be a catastrophe, because if you leave the European Union in order to escape from this utopian project and retain access to the single market, and so if you have a soft Brexit, that would be a catastrophe, because then you would have a pirate state, or as the current British foreign minister calls it, a buccaneering state that would enable to tailler les croupières, as we say in French, and to compete with the European Union from outside, and thereby sabotage the European project in its dimension of protecting the people, not only creating the single market.
Yeah, you mentioned the word redistribution in your words. You wrote that Europe urgently needs to build institutions that could redistribute wealth. During the crisis, there were also ideas to make a first step towards, let's say, a European unemployment benefits or something like that. Also, Europe would raise taxes on its own. It's still very, very at the beginning. Do you think this can work, or is it just now because of the COVID crisis that there is a momentum that we think we need something like that to prevent worse, but when the crisis is over, everything will return back to normal?
Yeah. Well, I think these would be steps in the right direction. And so I'm an opportunistic utopian. So I believe that we must have a vision that's far more ambitious than that. I believe in something that I call the Euro dividend, that is a real universal basic income at the level of the European Union and funded by the VAT, which is the most Europeanized of all taxes. But this is still far away. And in order to get that, indeed, we need to use opportunities. And the two steps you mentioned are important steps in that direction. That is, first, thinking about an EU-wide and EU-funded unemployment benefit in the form it has taken now. It's very modest. It's more a reinsurance system for the national involuntary unemployment benefit systems, on the one hand. And secondly, of course, the expansion of the own resources of the European Union is a very important precondition for anything more ambitious.
Yeah. We celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration in the month of May, and I will quote him in French. L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup, ni dans une construction d'ensemble. Elle se fera par les réalisations concrètes, créant d'abord une solidarité de fait. This idea of solidarity is crucial in all your work, but it's not the same as charity.
No, it's not the same as charity, and also solidarity is not the same as solidarité as used there, in the sense that, and so this is a very famous passage in Schumann's declaration, but also it came back in the preamble of the first European treaty, the Treaty of Paris, that created the steel and the coal and steel community, and there it speaks about the solidarité de fait. And that is indeed something that's extremely relevant to understand the history of European integration. What is meant there, and it's, then was referred to later as the méthode Monnet, and Monnet was certainly the one who wrote this passage, where in fact the solidarité de fait means interdependence. And so you have some degree of interdependence at the beginning, and so in 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, but then by creating the coal and steel community, you create further interdependence, further solidarité de fait. And then later, of course, when you created the euro, when you created the Schengen, the Schengen zone, all this created even further interdependence. And of course, the free circulation of people, the intense circulation of people is part of the source of the interdependence we witness now with the COVID. And so Monnet's point, or what is being said there, is that you create this solidarity and that will force you either to go back, and that would be very painful and very laborious, or to go even further in European integration, but you'll create even further interdependencies as a result. So that's one sense of solidarity. But the other one is the sense of solidarity which we use when we say we act out of solidarity. That's not just interdependence. It's the idea that we identify with others to the point that of helping them when they are in trouble. And that is, of course, presented as the principle that guides our welfare states, meant to be really the distinguishing feature of the European model compared to the North American model. But at the same time, of course, it's the same sense of solidarity at another level that's invoked when one says, well, the European member states must show solidarity towards each other. If one state has got big problems because of the migration flows, other countries must step in. If a country is particularly affected by the pandemic, other countries must step in. And of course, all three senses of solidarity are important to understand European integration and also to think about our future. And all that require us to build a stronger European we, which is related to some of the other things you heard today from the beginning.
I will end with a small final question. This Mayday magazine was written in English. We're talking English in this event, and it may sound strange because we're in Belgium. We should speak French and Dutch and German and maybe have English translation. But for you, if I read your work, it's okay. You embrace the English language and you see it as a tool for this European integration.
Yes, but let's be careful here. So I just became 10 days ago the chair of a new organ that was created by the Brussels government. It's called the Brussels Council for Multilingualism. And because we have in Brussels, since the last regional election, we have a minister in the Brussels government for the promotion of multilingualism. And so he asked me to help him compose this council and then to chair this council for the next 3 years. It's multilingualism, defined more precisely as the promotion of the knowledge of French, Dutch, and English among all layers of the Brussels population, while at the same time encouraging the transmission of the hundreds of native languages that are present in this city. So I'm certainly not in favor of a tout à l'anglais, where English could be a substitute for all the other languages. But English has its advantages, including at the Brussels level and the Belgian level, but also and especially at the European level. I just sent today the minutes of the last meeting of our council. Instead of writing these minutes in all three languages, the minutes are written exclusively in English because everyone in the council understands all three languages. We are not going to take the trouble of having three versions. Writing the minutes in French would be very sensitive because writing them exclusively in Dutch would be very sensitive. English is a fantastic compromise between the two, better than a compromise. I mean, it's just a mishmash of French and Dutch, right? And so it's very useful at our local level. It's useful at the Belgian level. I was told by the negotiators of an attempt to form a government between the NVA and the PS, that although the heads of the parties were speaking in their own language, or indeed in the language of the other partner, which they knew well enough, when it's a matter of the young chaps in the study centers to discuss about the technical matters, this was in English. And so that English in this sense, which is a second language in each of the three regions of the country, has an important role to play for the future of Belgium. But of course, even more at the European level. Last year, I was here on this stage at the invitation of Die Zeit Online. Die Zeit Online, at first organized in Germany, a big operation called Deutschland spricht, where they had people talking to each other despite all the differences in their views. And then they did that at the European level. And then, but how should it work at the European level? They first tried to ask each of the participants, what languages do you know? And the outcome would have been that the Austrians would be speaking with the Germans and the Francophones, Belgians with the French and a few Portuguese, etc. So instead, some of them had read the German translation of one of my books called Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World. And so they said, no, we must dare, despite being a German newspaper, to use the lingua franca. And so they asked me to come in 6 minutes to come here to justify that. I did that under the title, Give Us Back Our Language, because English is a continental language with a Germanic bit that was sent over the channel in the 5th century, a French bit that was sent In the 11th century, it was mishmashed together for a number of centuries. Now we want it back. We are not going to speak it like the Brits. We won't make them pay us for the fact that they could borrow it for such a long time, but we are going to use it not as a way of speaking with them. It will also serve that purpose, or speak with Mr. Trump if he wants to talk to us, but it will be mainly a tool for speaking among ourselves as we do in this room today.
Okay. I will like to thank you for these wise words, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you, Professor.
The generations born in the US and Europe since 1990 have seen the European Union expand and known only a unified Germany. They have experienced the introduction of the euro, and many have benefited from visa-free travel across the Schengen zone and semesters abroad with the Erasmus program.
I'm so glad that this works. Yanis Varoufakis, it was working, yeah. There's a former Greek minister of finance in the government in the aftermath of the financial crisis. He was a member of parliament and founder of the European movement DiEM25, but he's also a renowned scholar in the field of economics, and he taught in Great Britain, Australia, Greece, and even for a short period here in Belgium. Professor, I can't see you because my screen is not functioning, but welcome to BOZAR. You were here several times on this stage, and we're very glad to have you here in a virtual way through the wonders of Skype. Can you hear me?
Well, it is a mixed blessing and a sorrow. It's a blessing that I'm back, even through this very cold-hearted medium of Skype, very useful. And you know, it's a great sorrow that I'm not there with you. Okay. I wish I was there.
Professor, I will bring the audience back to a year was very crucial in your life and also in the history of Europe, was 2015. You were in Minister of Finance in Greece with in a period that your country was at the brink of collapse, and your colleagues in the Eurogroup imposed severe measures on Greece, on your country, as a condition to provide loans that would keep the system and the country afloat. You resigned because you didn't agree with the austerity measures that your colleagues wanted to impose, and you were supported by a referendum in Greece that gave you the permission to have that opinion, but your government decided to give in and you resigned. You said, okay, I cannot keep up with that anymore. Today we are in the midst of a new crisis, the COVID crisis pandemic, and it had much more severe negative effects on our world economy, and it will have severe effects on the budgets of the member states in the future. But this time the European leaders have already decided to pump 750 billion euros extra, supplementary, in the European economy. I was wondering what your thoughts would be about that. Isn't it a bit ironical, or that what wasn't possible in 2015 seems possible now? Okay.
Well, allow me to challenge the premise of the question, if I may. That's why you have me here, isn't it? Look, it's not a new crisis. It's the same old crisis, only that it has been turbocharged by a mindless piece of RNA, not even DNA, you know, COVID-19. This is not a new crisis. You will recall that even before the virus hit us, Europe was in a state of stagnation. We already had a return to very significant reductions in industrial production. Very briefly, because we don't want to bore with economics our audience, the crisis that began in 2008 in Wall Street and then spread through the banking system, particularly the banks of France and Germany, creating the ripple effects, the chain reaction that brought down Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, effectively, Spain, and so on, and infected also Germany with severe austerity for at least 50% of the population, who are far worse off today than they were 20 years ago. Let's not forget about that. That crisis never went away. The European Central Bank stepped in 2015, right at the same time that our government was being crushed for not accepting yet another credit card by which to pretend that we're repaying the previous credit cards. The central bank stepped in and zombified European capitalism, effectively pumped up trillions, gave it to the banks. The bank passed it on to large corporations, especially the north of Europe, but throughout Europe. The companies, however, didn't use this money for good purpose. They did not invest in good quality jobs or in the green transition that we need. Instead, they bought their own shares in the stock exchanges. They created a semblance of recovery. The financial markets were doing really very well, but the real economy, real investment in Europe has never been so low compared to the available liquidity. So, that was the situation before COVID-19 came. COVID-19 comes and we have, as I said, the turbocharging of a pre-existing crisis. And what did our great and good leaders do? They proved that they are perfectly capable of improving massively. But unlike the premise of your question, they didn't improve when it comes to the policy. They improved massively when it comes to the presentation. So they put you in a position where you're talking about 750 billion. Well, that's not there. The real injection is 310 billion. The rest is loans and repurposed money. Europe is very good at that, huge headline numbers, but when you look at it in reality, in the cold light of financing, the money is not there. 310 billion sounds like a lot of money. If you look at it from the perspective of the next 3 years when it has to be dispersed, it's less than 1% of GDP in our countries. And that's in the countries that will benefit more from it, like Italy, right? Compared to Belgium and Holland that will benefit a lot less. But at the same time, we have a hit to their economies that is going to be propagated next year and the year after that when we start balancing the budgets again with more austerity, a hit of about 7%. So 7% is the hit, 1% is at best, because I have my doubts about this 310 billion, whether it's going to be dispersed and when it's going to be dispersed. In other words, Europe has again managed to come out of this crisis with much better propaganda, but weakened, much weakened. And I'm afraid that the centrifugal forces that are tearing our continent apart and which are holding the great people of this continent behind vis-a-vis the Chinese and the United States. Yet again, European capitalism will have suffered a massive defeat. It will come out weaker out of yet another crisis.
So, if there is a parallel, the crisis that the governments had in 2015 was a late effect of the operations they had to do in 2008, 2009 to keep the banks afloat. Do you expect the same, that we're now in a period that there is seemingly member states don't have to mind the budget anymore, they can invest, they have to keep the system afloat, but that the bill will have to be paid afterwards? Is it so? It's not real investments that we're witnessing now, but that's what Europe is telling us, that they're giving us money to the different member states to invest in the system, to make Europe greener, to make Europe more digital, but the bill has to be paid anyway.
Take Italy, for instance. Take Italy. So that, I don't speak about Greece, I'm sick and tired of speaking about Greece. Take Italy, right? Italy was already in stagnation for a long time before COVID-19. COVID-19 comes and hits Italy, especially northern Italy, more than any other country, with the exception of Spain, perhaps, right? The economy is hit badly, massively, because of reliance on tourism. So you have a stagnant economy before the pandemic. The pandemic hits at the medical level, at the level of the health of the people badly. It also has a massive effect on the economy and on the budget of the country. It's going to get a few dozens of billions, but this time next year they are going to have to deal with a budget deficit of about 15% of GDP. That's massive. Even if they are allowed to take it down only to 3% deficit, not to go to surplus, as is the fiscal compact's, verdict, to go from minus 15 to minus 3, the government's not going to be investing anything. They're going to be cutting. They're going to be, indulging more and more austerity, while the recovery fund will be throwing a few billions onto particular companies that will benefit from that, but the macroeconomic impact overall is going to be very negative. And we are not going to be able, as Europe, if you look at it, from a bird's eye view, imagine you're an extraterrestrial and you're looking at Europe from way up there. Europe as a whole is going to be in austerity. It is not going to be investing sufficient from the recovery fund in order to ameliorate for the reduction in investment due to the chronic stagnation of investment that we had since 2008, which is now going to accelerate massively. Because what company is going to invest really now? They look at people out there and they think, they won't have the money to buy a competitor to Tesla, an expensive electric car. So why will Volkswagen use the money that will be given it by the German government, by the European Union government? Why will it invest into building a Tesla competitor? It won't, not in large numbers at least. So it won't create the good quality jobs that are necessary, nor the green transformation of the car industry, which is necessary in Europe. Instead, what they will do, and they're already doing it, they will take the money from the recovery from especially the central bank, and they will go to the Frankfurt Stock Exchange or to the London Stock Exchange, and they will be buying Volkswagen shares. So this is why you have this huge decoupling. On the one hand, financial markets are doing very, very well. The economy is tanking. How do we explain that? Very simple. The support that comes from our central bank is translating into cash that the large corporations get, but they don't invest, they buy back their own shares. So this is a unique phenomenon in the history of capitalism and a major defeat of European capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, after 2015, you resigned, but you started a pan-European movement, DiEM25. You were trying to convince European voters that we need this European party that would have lists in all countries and to really have what we was discussing here with Professor Van Parijs, this European demos that could really get rid of all the differences between the countries, etc. It wasn't a huge success, your party, during the elections, but still, can you explain why you thought that was the crucial step to take after 2015? You could have chosen other ways to remain active politically. You're now still in politics, of course, but...
Of course, I could have not resigned if I wanted. If I cared about being a minister, I could have chosen not to resign, right? And certainly not to start a pan-European transnational movement with a bunch of friends, knowing full well that we didn't have the funding or the coverage to. And you said that we didn't do that well. Well, we didn't. We didn't get anyone elected in the European Parliament, but we managed to get 1.5 million votes across Europe on a budget of about 60,000 euros, which is not a terrible failure, I don't think. But look, for us, it was both a symbolic and a long-term project. We haven't given up. We are continuing. I think we're going to succeed. And if we don't succeed, I think Europe is in trouble, allow me to say. Why? Because we have one crisis. Like climate change is not a Dutch crisis or a Greek crisis, it's a universal crisis, a European crisis. Debt, poverty, inequality, none of those crises can be dealt with at the nation-state level. I mean, the pandemic cannot be dealt with at the nation-state level. So we need a European solution. So we need, this is what we envisage, and that's what we managed to do in May 2019, even though we didn't get elected in the European Parliament. We campaigned on the basis of a single program
Can we get him back? Or what? Okay, just the sound. We just need the sound. Okay, yeah, you're back.
Okay, yep. So the wonders of modern technology. I was saying that we have one crisis, one set of problems. We cannot solve those problems at the basis of nation-state policies. And what we did was, and we are very proud of that, we sat around the table, thousands of us from across Europe, Portuguese, Dutch people, Swedes, Germans, Greeks, Italians, and we came up with one manifesto, one policy proposal, which we called, by the way, a Green New Deal for Europe. And we campaigned along the lines of that policy document everywhere in Europe. And it was a very constructive policy document. We had answers to the question, so what should the central bank be doing instead of what it is doing? Where will the 500 billion we need every year to invest in the green transition come from? What about the universal basic dividend or income? How should this be funded? And I'm not going to, tire you with the answers we gave, but we set out all the important questions that need to be answered at the pan-European level. And we tried to campaign along the lines of the answers we collectively created as a transnational movement.
When I hear you talking about these points, I immediately come to a new book that you just published, which is called Another Now: Dispatches from an Alternative Present. It's a fiction novel. It's a novel about a group of people, but you set forward there, you paint a picture of a new society, and it's coming from the fact you are a socialist. That's no secret. You're proud of being socialist, and a lot of people on the left side of politics have criticized capitalism, have criticized neoliberalism, but every time when you ask people from the left, what's your alternative, they all become very quiet, because they don't want to go back to communism, they don't like social democrats, because they sold out. But in your book, you're trying to give an impression of, let's say, this socialist society that maybe could work. And it's a society with no banks, no tech, no stock markets, no tech giants, and no billionaires. But I do presume that you don't consider it to be science fiction. Do you really believe that what's in your book can be one day reality, and which steps would be taken first to lead us on that path?
Yes, it's a book that describes an almost fully functioning, realistic utopia. Allow me to say that, some people will think that I'm confused, and maybe I am, but I'm a liberal, and I'm also a Marxist. Now, some people say you can't be a liberal and be a Marxist, and some others will say you can't be a Marxist if you're a liberal, but I'm both. I believe the only way, my critique of capitalism is firstly that it is inefficient. It wastes human resources. Not that it is unfair. If it is unfair, that's a side effect of its inefficiency. And it's not sufficiently liberating. The moment you enter Google as an employee, right, you enter a centrally planned system that is very similar to the Soviet Union. I mean, it's more beautiful than the Soviet Union, maybe more efficient, but it's like, it's a hierarchy. There are no markets within Google. There are no markets within Facebook. It's a strict hierarchy. So if you're a liberal, you can't possibly appreciate the lack of democracy in the corporations. So the question I had always in my mind, okay, I'm a critic of capitalism. I believe that a society can be created that is democratic within the realm of work. So you can have democratic corporations in which people can actually be free of hierarchy and free of the oppression of both the state and of the corporation. But how would that society work? So I decided I'm going to, I'm 60 this year. It's about time I put my money where my mouth is, as the English would say, right? Mm-hmm. And I decided to sit down and write, a blueprint. How would that society work? How would corporations work? What would money be like? Who would issue the money? How would it function? How would it not usurp democracy? How would we combine perfect liberty, or as perfect liberty as we can have, with solidarity? So I described how markets would work. It's a market society. It's a fully fledged market society, which The way I try to describe it, it's actually more of a free market than capitalism is, because in capitalism you have the financiers and you have the large conglomerates, and they effectively destroy competition. They create monopolies. Look at Facebook, for instance. There's no competition for Facebook. It owns the marketplace. Very soon it will own our souls as well, right? So, but because, sitting down and writing a description of an imaginary society sounded boring to me. And because I disagreed with myself about, many of the aspects that should be crucial to such a future realistic utopia, I decided that the only way of actually motivating myself to doing it is to have characters, to have, a neoliberal, a Marxist, a technologist, and they can fight it amongst themselves, and they have, kind of Platonic, Socratic dialogues amongst themselves. And science fiction is just simply a tool for allowing them to get a glimpse of that society so they can comment on it. And can compare our society, the capitalism that we have, this now, with another now. And I really enjoyed that. I have to confess. I hope readers enjoy it, but I loved it because halfway into writing the book, those characters effectively separated themselves from me. And it was as if I was, as if they were writing their own dialogues. And I was there watching them and listening in to their conversations. And I was learning from them. And, at some point I caught myself thinking, oh my God, what are they going to think of next? And what's going to happen next? So, I got caught up in the writing of that book in a way which filled me with huge pleasure. Now, let's see what the readership think.
Okay. Yanis Varoufakis, I would like to thank you very much for being here with us today in this strange, awkward way. I hope to see you back live here on this stage in the near future, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
At BOZAR, we have one project that we cherish even more than the Mayday magazine, and it's called Next Generation, Please. It's a project where artists and politicians and activists work together with pupils and students from all over Belgium to make music, performances, poetry, or visual arts. And the results of their work are shown here in BOZAR. You can visit the exhibition here for the next coming weeks. Last year, we were amazed by the crump performance of the boys and girls of La Baraka Youth Center in Liège. And they examine how they can use a dance style, crumping, I never heard of it, but it exists and it's marvelous, in the defense, to defend their own rights. It's a very political dance. Today we present to you Drix Kanzi, a group of boys and girls that are 100% crump, directed by Hendrix. I will leave the stage because they need it completely.
Rotating bodies, confusion is sound. negative imagery holding us down, social delusion, clearly constructed, human condition, morals corrupted, trapped in reaction, lawlessness, war, dissatisfaction from bowels to core, devil's technology, strategy 4, human mythologies, urban folklore, sicker psychology, counterfeit cure, wicked theology robbing the poor, scheme demonology mislead the pure, stricken strategically studying war, light shown in darkness, image exposed, few can see through the new emperor's clothes, lustful this hustle turns humans to hoes, when the blind lead the blind just more trouble and woes, it's the mind that they chose, it's designed to stay closed, standards of jokers, court just the logic, cyclic and cosmic from schoolyard to college, primitive man in his civilized knowledge, system collapse and he still won't acknowledge, God is the savior, studies behavior, trying to fix the mixed mind that he gave you, stiff-necked scholars on prescription meds, wishing their problems was all in their heads, moral dilemma, pride at the root, misguided from youth, heart divided from truth, Egyptians and Grecians, spiritually dead, empirically led by the good gods in their heads, motives and thoughts, industrial wealth, global economy in it for self, heart full of madness, covered with kind, pleasure designed to take over your mind, furnished in godliness, painted in good, this tainted priesthood's got real saints misunderstood, while classes and government set up the veil and cultivate minds for more mythical tales, typical Hollywood, follies, good girl, while vice and corruption take over the world, motives and thoughts. Studying war, light shown in darkness, image exposed, few can see through the new emperor's clothes, lustful this hustle turns humans to hoes, when the blind lead the blind just more trouble and woes, it's the mind that they chose, it's designed to stay closed, standards of jokers, court just the logic, cyclic and cosmic from schoolyard to college, primitive man in his civilized knowledge, system collapse and he still won't acknowledge, God is the savior, studies behavior, trying to fix the mixed mind that he gave you. Stiff-necked scholars on prescription meds, wishing their problems was all in their heads. Moral dilemma, pride at the root, misguided from youth, heart divided from truth. Egyptians and Grecians, spiritually dead, empirically led by the good gods in their heads. Motives and thoughts, industrial wealth, global economy in it for self. Heart full of madness, covered with kind, pleasure designed to take over your mind.
When I pack up my bags and leave this world behind. start at. Gotta put the keys, the drug making the streets. With it from the get high with it. He could just strut on his own too. If he knew the wet from the bet you there's a heaven for him. Then his power, even if you can feel, but you still gotta practice. The kid making the streets. Stop smoking on his own land. He was just the west and the back. I bet you there's a heaven for him. The way in his land. If you knew the kid high with it.
There's one thing I have to do, and that's show you the magazine. It will be available in our bookshop. Costs you only 15 euros. You can also buy it through the website of Are We Europe. But I'd like to ask one person on the stage, without whom this magazine would never have been made, my colleague Pamela Peters. Pamela, this is the first copy. You should be proud of all the work you did. Without your help, we never could have pulled this off. There's also something sad, I must tell you. Pamela is leaving us. She was been in BOZAR Agora for 2 years now. 5 years? No. At BOZAR, but at my department, not so long. I will miss you every day from now on. I hope in your next job in the Photo Museum in Antwerp, they have made an excellent choice by hiring Pamela. So I would like to thank you and wish you all the best in the future. Thank you. And now somebody has to come with the flowers. I would also like to thank, et je vais le dire en français, je veux remercier toute l'équipe technique de BOZAR. On a eu hier la panique. Un de nos collègues était en quarantaine à cause du Covid. On a dû changer toutes nos préparations pour cette soirée. Et j'espère que vous n'avez pas remarqué trop de glitch ici et par là. Et je remercie toute l'équipe de BOZAR et aussi les gens qui sont de la régie TV, qui sont responsables pour tout ce qui est télévision et Skype et tout. Merci et bonne soirée.